In Ohio, Curtis stands in the rain looking at the huge clouds and is confused, thinking that instead of water, it's motor oil. But it's just a dream and the weather is actually beautiful. Afterward, Curtis has breakfast with his wife Samantha and deaf daughter Hannah, and then leaves for work. Curtis works for a construction company while Samantha takes care of the house, takes care of Hannah, and sews things to sell at the local fair on Saturdays. On this day, Samantha spends time with her friends who have brought their children to the playground. One of the women notices that Hannah has grabbed a dangerous piece of wood with nails in it, and Samantha runs outside to stop her, as shouting warnings doesn't help. Later, it starts raining heavily, forcing the builders to stop work for the day, and Curtis and his colleagues go to a bar. At home, Samantha shows Hannah the storm sign while watching the rain through the window. After the bar, Curtis stops by his co-worker and friend Duarte's house. They talk for a bit, and Duarte says Curtis has a great life. But Curtis admits that not everything is as smooth as it seems. Their conversation is interrupted by Duarte's wife, who silently walks outside and demands that he return to the house. Afterward, Curtis goes home and checks on Hannah. He learns from Samantha that the girl still has trouble socializing with other children. The next day, Curtis takes out the trash so Hannah doesn't find anything dangerous. At that moment, a violent thunderstorm starts and lightning strikes the ground. Curtis's dog named Red starts barking furiously. When Curtis tries to take Hannah's hand, the dog snaps and bites him. But then he wakes up in his room realizing it was just another nightmare. At breakfast, Curtis can't stop thinking about how real the dream was. He sees Hannah playing with the dog and is worried, so he takes her away from the dog. When Samantha asks what's wrong, Curtis snaps and leaves without even touching his breakfast. Later at work, Curtis continues to be distracted and won't stop looking at his hand, thinking he can still feel the pain. A boss named Jim is angry about the delay due to the rain and wants them to catch up today. On the way to the construction site, Curtis asks Duarte to help him grab some extra materials first. Later, Curtis takes a break and sees a flock of black birds flying strangely in the sky. He asks Duarte if he thinks it's strange, but Duarte didn't notice anything. With the extra hours spent catching up on work that has been delayed, Curtis is late for a parent-teacher conference at Hannah's school. Plus he's dirty because he didn't have time to shower. They are told about the importance of sign language for their children, which Curtis should practice more often. Since he doesn't spend as much time with Hannah as Samantha, he doesn't know enough words yet. After a while, it rains again, and Curtis gets into the car with his daughter. On the way, visibility is poor because of the rain, and they have an accident. Curtis is bleeding, but Hannah is okay. At that moment, men appear near the car and start smashing the windows. One of them holds Curtis down and the other kidnaps the girl. Suddenly Curtis wakes up screaming, realizing that it was just another dream. He then comes downstairs looking pretty sick. Samantha notices this and worries, but Curtis promises that it's just a cold and tells her to go to the fair with Hannah. While Samantha sells her goods and argues with customers about prices, Curtis gets some extra materials from work and builds a fence around the booth and locks Red in it, apologizing to the poor guy. Now he has to get to work cleaning up the trash, but he notices a door leading to the storm shelter. Curtis looks for a key in an old jar and manages to open the doors, then goes down there to think of a new idea. Later that night, Samantha puts the money she made in there, along with their vacation savings. She asks Curtis why they are keeping Red outside, but Curtis gives only an indefinite answer. Samantha tries to ask again, but Curtis ignores her to listen to the news about a gas leak affecting a small family. This heightens Curtis's paranoia. The next day, Curtis finds Hannah watching the storm through a window. As he gets closer, he is surprised to see a man standing outside watching them. Curtis immediately takes Hannah in his arms and runs to hide while the man tries to open the door. Suddenly, the whole building starts to shake, and all the objects in the living room levitate, and Curtis finds it hard to breathe. Then everything collapses and Curtis suffocates, waking up from another nightmare. To his shock, he has wet the bed. When Samantha enters, he covers his accident with a blanket. Curtis asks for the doctor's number and Samantha, out of concern, tries to check on him, but Curtis snaps back so she doesn't see the wet sheets. He immediately apologizes for his outburst, justifying that he's just not feeling well, and tells her to go to church alone and he'll take care of Hannah. After Samantha leaves, Curtis changes the sheets and washes the linens. Later, Curtis takes Hannah to the library and distracts her with a children's book while he himself searches for information on mental illness. On the way back, they stop at the grocery store to buy lots of canned goods. This makes them late for lunch with Hannah's family, who condemns him for skipping church. After lunch, Curtis starts cleaning out the storm shelter and puts all the canned goods he brought in there in case of an emergency. He then stays there reading books from the library. After a while, Curtis finally gets to see a doctor and tells him that he hasn't been able to sleep for 4 days. At first, the doctor thinks there's nothing wrong, but Curtis tells him about the nightmares, admits that he wet the bed and that he constantly feels pain from a dog bite. The doctor agrees to give him medication for a few days and advises advises him to see a psychiatrist in Columbus. Meanwhile, Samantha visits an insurance agency to inquire about surgery to restore Hannah's hearing. Luckily, her request is approved, and all expenses will be covered because Curtis is offered a very favorable policy. At the same time, Curtis goes to the pharmacy to buy medicine, and is surprised to find out that thanks to the insurance he will not have to pay much. That evening the family has a wonderful dinner celebrating the good news, but Curtis does not tell them about his medicine. As they get ready for bed, Samantha begins to make plans for a vacation because they will no longer have to worry about money. Curtis secretly takes his medicine in the bathroom. The next morning Curtis wakes up rested, and Samantha notices that he looks healthier too. At work, however, Curtis continues to talk to Duarte about the amount of food he needs for his hideout. Suddenly, he hears thunder in the clear sky. He asks Duarte about it, but he has heard nothing. Curtis runs in a panic toward where he is being ripped out. Struggling with a panic attack, Curtis quits his job and starts breathing heavily behind the wheel, so he stops the car to take a break and regain control. When he finally calms down, he notices a place that sells containers and buys one to expand the shelter. Moments later, he visits his mother, who is acting awkwardly because she is on strong medication. Turns out she developed paranoid schizophrenia around the same age Curtis is now. He worries that the same thing might happen to him and tries to ask some questions, but she doesn't remember much about those intense years. Curtis then calls his doctor and explains that he can't go to Columbus to see a psychiatrist, so he asks for an alternative. That evening he calculates how much it will cost to turn the asylum into a full-fledged bunker. The next morning he goes to the bank and takes out a loan to renovate the house without telling his wife and ignoring his agent's warnings. Later at work, Curtis asks Duarte for help because he wants to take equipment from work to build his shelter. It's against the rules, but his friend agrees to help. The concerned friend also asks him if he's okay, and Curtis assures him that he is. After work, Curtis goes to a local psychologist and pours out all his theories based on his research. The woman explains that she's just a counselor, so she can't diagnose him or prescribe anything, but they can talk so she can help him through the crisis. He begins to talk about his mother who left the family one day, and his father had to take care of him and his brother alone. She was later found eating garbage from a dumpster. She had to be admitted to a state hospital. He also begins to talk about his dreams. In the evening, the family goes to another school meeting. On the way back, Curtis stops the car because he sees lightning in the sky. However, his family has fallen asleep, and of the drivers, none of them react. This makes him even more worried about his mental health. Meanwhile, while Samantha and Hannah are at the fair, Curtis and Duarte start working on a shelter. When Samantha arrives and sees all of this, she loses her temper. A fight breaks out between the two of them. Samantha gets even angrier when she hears that Curtis has taken out a loan. She screams, demanding an explanation for all his strange decisions lately. Curtis, however, says there is nothing to explain. He leaves the room to check on Hannah while Samantha has a breakdown. That night, Curtis takes more medication than he should. In the middle of the night, Samantha wakes up to find Curtis beside her in a seizure and bleeding. She immediately calls an ambulance, ignoring Curtis' words that it is not necessary. A few minutes after the doctors leave, Curtis finally tells Samantha everything. He vows that he will see a counselor often because he doesn't want to abandon his family like his mother did. The next day, Curtis and Samantha take Hannah to the hospital for a checkup. The surgery is scheduled in 6 weeks. At work, Curtis goes to his boss and asks him to remove Duarte from the team because he doesn't want to give orders to his best friend. Jim thinks it's weird, but agrees. Then he notes that Curtis has been skipping work a lot. Curtis explains that it's because of Hannah's doctor's appointments, but Jim warns him not to take too much time off. After work, Curtis goes to the store to buy gas masks, which turn out to be very expensive. Meanwhile, Duarte's wife tells Samantha about the rumors surrounding Curtis' behavior, but Samantha defends herself and swears that everything is fine. A short time later, Curtis is repairing the hideout when he receives a visit from his brother Kyle, who learned about Curtis' strange behavior from Samantha. Kyle is worried about Curtis' health, but Curtis continues to claim he's fine. He advises his brother to visit their mother. It becomes clear that the brothers have a very awkward relationship. Before his brother leaves, Curtis remembers that he was looking for a dog and asks him to take Red in. On a stormy afternoon, Curtis walks into the kitchen and finds Samantha soaked from the rain. They stare at each other for a while before she decides to grab a knife. However, that is another dream. At breakfast, Curtis can't shake the feeling of a strange nightmare. When Samantha tries to touch his hands, he pulls them away. At that moment, they notice Jim waiting outside. Curtis rushes to meet him and hears the terrible news. Jim has found out about the equipment Curtis borrowed illegally. He fires him, giving him health insurance for only 2 more weeks. Duarte also received 2 weeks of unpaid administrative leave for his help. When Curtis shares the news with Samantha, she slaps him and then runs from the room with Hannah. Later, Curtis visits his counselor but finds that the woman has been transferred. A new man has taken her place. This person wants him to start all over again, but Curtis can't get over himself, so he leaves without a word. Meanwhile, Samantha continues to mend the neighbor's clothes to make money, but it's not enough, and she has to take the rest of her savings from their vacation bank. In the evening, Samantha talks to Curtis, who explains that he was startled out of his sleep. He grabs her hand to prove that he's working on it. Samantha announces that they're canceling the trip to the beach and using his last check to pay 2 months' worth of bills. She will postpone Hannah's surgery. They both need to focus on finding jobs. Samantha is willing to work on their problems, but she makes it a condition that Curtis must see a real psychiatrist. She also wants him to come to a school dinner on the weekend to work on his isolation. On the day of the event, Curtis runs into Duarte, who blames him for his suspension. Curtis tries to suggest that he talk to him later in private, but his friend continues to escalate the situation. Duarte pushes and punches Curtis, and he fights him off. Eventually, Curtis snaps and throws the table to the floor with a scream. He announces that a devastating storm is coming, and no one is prepared for it. He then has a breakdown, and Samantha takes the opportunity to take him home. After a while, Curtis sees Hannah in the middle of the road and runs after her. At that moment, a bunch of birds appear in the sky and fly in strange patterns. They then head towards Curtis. He protects Hannah while the birds fly past them. Then they start dropping dead to the ground. Terrified, he runs back into the house when a siren starts howling. At this point, he wakes up and discovers that the siren is sounding in real life. It's raining heavily, so Curtis takes his family and they run to hide in a shelter. After closing the door, Curtis makes them put on oxygen masks just in case. Then they fall asleep and wait for the storm to pass. A few hours later, Curtis wakes up and checks the door, but he can still feel the storm outside and goes back to sleep. In the morning, Samantha wakes him up and asks him to open the door because the storm is over. Curtis disagrees and says he can still hear it and makes Samantha touch the door so she can feel it. However, Samantha can't hear or feel anything. In a panic, Curtis steps back and refuses to open the door, offering the key to his wife. Samantha refuses to take it because doing it for him will only delay the problem, and Curtis needs to confront his fears. Wanting to be good, Curtis pulls himself together and finally opens the door to see a beautiful sunny day. The neighbors are fine and picking up the trash left over from the storm. After a while, Samantha finally takes Curtis to a psychiatrist. The doctor agrees to immediately prescribe Curtis new medication and decides that he needs to be away from his hiding place. He tells the family to take a few days off to rest and prepare because Curtis will need to be institutionalized until he recovers. That means he won't see his family for a while. The next day, the family heads to the beach. Curtis and Hannah are building a sandcastle when suddenly Hannah, pointing out to sea, writes the word storm. Samantha comes out and discovers that it is raining oil. At this point, the whole family see a huge dark storm approaching in the distance, and Curtis turns to Samantha, who nods at him to confirm that she sees it too.